Greetings from the Jazz Cloud. I'm Richie Zellon, and I'd like to welcome you to the Jazz Guitar channel. Recently, many of my beginning students have been asking me about scale superimposition. What is it and how to use it? So in this lesson, I'm going to answer those questions, also give you the pros and cons some of you may not be aware of when using this concept. The dictionary defines superimposition as the act of placing or laying over something. In the case of scale superimposition, we are employing a different scale in the place of an existing one. And guess what? Many of us have been unknowingly using superimposition for a long time. When I started out, I was a rock and blues player, and I used the same 5-note scale to play over several chords. My knowledge and understanding of theory was zilch, nada. So I didn't know that each chord in the progression had its own dedicated scale. Today I understand that what I was doing when I used the same scale I had employed over the 1 chord, again over the 4 and 5 chord, was in essence a form of scale superimposition. It's very simple compared to how we use it in jazz, but effective nonetheless for the 3-chord 12-bar blues, which is what I was playing. And of course, I'm referring here to the gin and tonic scale, otherwise known as the minor pentatonic. You see, I've always called it the gin and tonic scale because it's commonly played over the blues, inside a bar, and the lyrics often drive you to drink. And believe me when I tell you I speak from experience. So today, even though I teach a lot of jazz blues to my beginning students, I do so without superimposition of the gin and tonic scale. Instead, I start them out with the Mixolydian mode, which in turn changes its root to match that of every new chord. So, if you're an alcoholic due to all those years just playing the gin and tonic, no need to panic. And please don't waste your time with AA meetings. I've got the best rehab program, and it's called the Bebop Guitar Improv Series. So now that you kind of understand the general concept, let me give you some examples of how superimposition is used in jazz. Unlike how we use it in rock and blues, in jazz we often use it by using a different scale over each chord shade. For example, take guitarist Pat Martino. He is big on superimposing minor modes over everything. And what he does is what I like to call relative mode superimposition. This simply means that the scale he is superimposing has the same notes as the original one, only that in a different order. I'm first going to use a major 2-5-1 to demonstrate this concept, and I'm doing this in the key of C. And these are the original modes. So for the D minor 7, we use a D Dorian. Note that this is the original scale that corresponds to this chord, so no superimposition here. On the other hand, when we arrive at the G7, which normally takes a G Mixolydian, next we are going to superimpose the same D Dorian we just employed over the D minor 7. Note that D Dorian is a relative mode of G Mixolydian, so it has the same notes. And this is where many of you might be wondering, why D Dorian and not any of the other relative modes, such as maybe F Lydian or even the parent scale, which is C Ionian? Well, that's a good question. And the answer is that you can indeed superimpose any of those modes But when using relative mode superimposition, the choice is a matter of convenience. In other words, you want to make things easier. And mentally speaking, it is easier to remain over D Dorian when changing over to G7 than switching to another mode. In Pat Martino's case, he wants to keep everything in the minor family. Now, keep in mind that these are the pros of the concept. In brief, I will explain the cons. Meanwhile, let's move on to the final chord in the cadence, which is the C major 7. And this chord originally uses a C Ionian, but here we would superimpose an A Aeolian. Again, this is a matter of convenience. A Aeolian is the relative minor of C Ionian. Furthermore, there is only a one-note difference between it and the Dorian. So if you're familiar with the Dorian, all you have to do is flat the sixth, and you instantly have an Aeolian scale. Your thinking over the scale remains the same for the most part. So to recap, here are the modes we could use when superimposing over a major 2-5-1. And here's another alternative. For a minor 2-5-1, the concept of superimposition is a lot more convenient. Here the 2 minor 7 flat 5 normally takes a Locrian, the 5-7 altered a superlocrian, and the 1 minor can be an Aeolian or melodic minor depending on the form of minor tonality. And here they are in the key of C. And here we want to keep everything minor. In the case of a D minor 7 flat 5, we would superimpose an F Dorian. And if the chord has a 9th in it, we would instead superimpose an F melodic minor. For the G7 altered, instead of the hard to play superlocrian, we would superimpose an A flat melodic minor. And for the C minor 7, we would preserve the original C Aeolian. For the D minor, we superimpose an F Dorian, a minor 3rd up. For the 5 chord G7 altered in this case, we superimpose a melodic minor half step up. And for the 1 chord, in this case C minor 7, we just play a regular C Aeolian. So I'm sure that by now you are getting a feel for the pros of using this concept, but there are also some serious cons to consider, especially if you're not a more experienced jazz player. First and foremost, you are not aware of what the note in the mode you are playing is in relation to the scale and chord you are superimposing over. For example, when you superimpose a D Dorian over a G7, the flat 7 in the D Dorian is actually the 4 in the original G7 Mixolydian. And guess what? This is an avoid note and will clash with the chord. That is, if you use it as you normally would when playing and thinking over a Dorian. So I'm going to improvise like I normally would over a D Dorian, and I'm going to start and end on the flatted 7, which is a very common thing to do. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, it sounds fine over a D minor 7th chord because it responds to that chord, but when we superimpose the same concept over a G7, the 5 chord, notice what happens when I start and end on the flatted 7. 2, 3, 4. It clashes because that's the avoid note. That's the 4 in the G7. This type of scenario happens over many superimposed scales. In the case of a seasoned player like Pat Martino, he can see all the underlying intervallic equivalencies between the original scale and the one being superimposed. But this is not the case with most beginner to intermediate jazz players. Fortunately, this pitfall is not applicable to any of the melodic minor modes, which don't contain avoid notes. The second con is that you constantly have to work out the intervallic relationship between the mode you want to superimpose and the location of the original. Fortunately, this is not so grave on the guitar because you can memorize the visual relationship between both roots. Most of us, for example, find it easy to figure out the relative minor of any major chord by visualizing a minor third down. Now, the third con is probably the most serious for a newer jazz player, and it is related to ear training. When you improvise, you want to hear and identify the true root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th of the chord being played so you can go straight for it. You also want to use smooth voice leading at the point of chord change frequently to a guide tone. However, if you never learned the true scale that corresponds to the chord being played and just learned to superimpose over it, this may present a problem. And I myself had a problem with this early on. What I superimposed sounded good for the most part, but I had no control of what I was hearing in relation to the true chord. I eventually went back to actually learn my Locrian and Superlocrian, which I dreaded. And now I can use any superimposition and both hear and see the true intervals of the original underlying scale. Before continuing, I just want to add that superimposition is used not only with scales, but also with triads and chords in general. Also, if you want to look at another system fully based on this concept, check out a video I did recently on the Lydian chromatic concept, which Miles Davis and others apparently started using back in the late 50s. And its originator, George Russell, doesn't really mention the term superimposition in the method, but in many ways, that's what is going on if you peek under the hood, like I did. And having said that, I now want to explain what I like to call outside superimposition. And this is when we superimpose a scale that has notes in it which are not diatonic to the original one. And the way I understand it, the Lydian chromatic concept, which I just mentioned, is based on a tonal spectrum gradually ranging from relative mode superimposition all the way to outside superimposition. And a good early example of outside superimposition even though it isn't necessarily based on the Lydian chromatic concept, is what John Coltrane began doing over modal compositions such as impressions, where the same chord remains static over several measures. So he, in essence, was superimposing a new chord progression over the existing one, both to create harmonic motion as well as tension and resolve. Let me demonstrate. I hope this has answered your questions and cleared up any confusion you might have had regarding superimposition of scales. If you want to get deeper into this concept, in Volume 2, Lesson 5 of the Bebop Guitar Improv series, I show you different alternatives to use relative mode superimposition with the proper scale choices in a way that you won't have to worry about improperly using avoid notes. I also map out the superimposition changes to several complex progressions you often encounter in some jazz standards and how to simplify them using this system. Also, as a follow-up to this lesson, I will soon be posting a series on pentatonic or gin and tonic superimposition, which again is something John Coltrane did a lot and has become part of the post-bop jazz idiom. As usual, I appreciate your comments and welcome your questions. And if this is your first time on the Jazz Guitar channel and you enjoyed this lesson, please subscribe and don't forget to click on the bell icon so you will be notified of my upcoming lessons. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and until then, stay safe and may peace be with you. Shalom y nos vemos pronto.